Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here for this important presentation. Let me introduce our congregant and dear friend, Marion Lewin. Thank you, Marion, for doing this. Marion and Stephen were born 45 minutes apart in Amsterdam, Holland. I'm not going to say the year. You can ask her that later. They are among the few sets of twins who survived the concentration camps, and at this point, quite possibly the last. Marion's earliest memory was the night when the Nazis and the Dutch police raided their home in Amsterdam to pick them up for deportation. The family was told to get dressed and get out quickly. Marion wanted to get her and Stephen's daily treat, candy that their mother placed in a wooden Dutch shoe each evening. But there was no time. Marion says, I vividly remember the night we were picked up and the horror of it. Though they did not understand this at age 4, the children's lives had already changed. They weren't allowed to go to school or to play. Stephen remembers that all the shades in the house were drawn. And Marion says, my mother would keep pulling me away from this fascination. Stephen says, the physical memory of being dragged from your house into the street in chaos and with trucks and lights was profoundly confusing. Marion's message, Stephen's message, is timely, necessary to not only understand ourselves, but to continue to promote and pass on. I pray and have prayed for years to create a society where people embrace each other and recognize their value and see the commonality that we have. Maybe someday that will happen. But without further ado from me, it is my pleasure to introduce our congregant and my friend, Marion Lewin. Thank you for being here.
I feel particularly honored to be on this bima for the commemoration of Yom HaShoah, when we remember and honor the Holocaust. I always feel humbled, and that's maybe why it's only in these last few years that I've really spoken about my background. I always feel humbled talking about the Holocaust because I was a survivor. And I think of all the people who were had as much hope and promise as I had, but didn't make it. So I always feel that I stand for them rather than just being here for me. Before I begin, I want to thank Cheryl Kramer and the Engage Committee, who did a great job. I'm sure there are other people on that list who should be thanked, but your attentiveness and your caring about this program were really very much appreciated. I want to just quickly say hello just to the Coes, Susan and Barry. I know that they mean something to all of you, but they're like my guiding star when my home in Easton. And then I don't have my kids here, but I have Claudia and Bill Stiebel, who are part of my family, who came from Virginia, and I appreciate them being here. And also my friend Lynn, who was my roommate last night. I want to dedicate this hour to my late husband, Larry Lewin, whose yahrzeit was actually just a few days ago. And we bought the house here now, I guess in 1993, and this became his spiritual home. He had so many connections to Temple B'nai Israel, and Peter Hyman became truly one of his best friends. They shared Boy Scout stories and all other kinds of things that they cared about and loved. Rabbi Hyman presided over his funeral, and so it's a little bit coming full circle. And I did want to dedicate this talk to Larry Lewin, and I'm sure his spirit is with us today. Okay, let me begin and tell you a little bit about the book. Inseparable, which is written by an award-winning author, Ferris Castle, is in part a tale of darkness and despair, of unspeakable tragedy and immeasurable loss, but also a story of courage, resilience, and overcoming. Even today, a lifetime later, I can only describe our survival as a family as a miracle, but a miracle made possible in part by our parents, Carl and Ilse Hess, their ability to endure against impossible odds and sustain some flicker of hope when all their eyes could see was inhumanity and cruelty on a scale never seen before. I've always believed our parents' strength and will to survive was because of their little twins, as we were commonly referred to by our fellow prisoners. Young twins were notable in the ecosystem of concentration camps. Of no use as slave laborers, they were usually immediately shipped off to extermination camps, particularly Auschwitz and Sobibor, where they were mutilated for experimental purposes or immediately put to death. Today, my brother Stephen and I are in all likelihood the last remaining twins of the Holocaust, certainly from Bergen-Belsen. Our parents were born in Germany but moved to Amsterdam in 1936 when it was no longer viable for Jews to stay in their homeland. My twin brother Stephen Hess and I were born in 1938, so now you know my age, 2 years before German Nazi forces invaded Holland and quickly overran the country. Even at age 5, going on 6, my brother and I still have memories of a time of freedom and delight turned quickly into a world of terror and apprehension. Going out to play was no longer an option. Children's laughter was suppressed. Adult conversations turned to whispers, and smiling faces were transformed to countenance of fear and anxiety. Various essentials were packed in small suitcases and placed at the front door in preparation for the inevitable knock on the door, or razzia, as the Nazis carried out their methodical plans to eliminate any Jewish presence in countries under their control. Our time came on July 23, 1943, when we were forcefully taken away from our home and herded away to an endpoint unknown and over which we had no control. We were first sent to Westerbork, a transit camp in the northeastern part of the Netherlands, not far from the German border. I remember the endless mud, fierce flies, and constant turmoil during the months we stayed there. In the middle of the camp was the ominous train track, where like clockwork each week, an empty, filthy string of cattle cars materialized overnight to collect the next batch of prisoners. The Nazis' command demanded that each train meet its precise quota of human beings, among them the 1.5 million children of the 6 million that eventually died in the Holocaust. I remember the wails and tears of those designated for the next transport to a place unknown. Did they know that in the vast majority of cases, they were going to a place of no return? On February 15, 1944, it was our turn to board these hellish transports, without seats, without toilets, without food or water. The train was headed east to Bergen-Belsen, not far from Hanover, Germany. The day marked our parents' 10th wedding anniversary. It was during our 14 months imprisonment in Belsen that the camp became unlivable because of overcrowding, starvation, lack of medical care, and a typhus epidemic. As the war was coming to an end and the Nazis wanted to destroy all evidence of their brutality, we, together with 2,500 barely alive Jews, were put on what became known as the Lost Train, officially headed to Theresienstadt, but Allied bombings prevented it from reaching that destination. After 13 days of ambling, seemingly aimlessly through eastern Germany, the train was liberated by the Red Army near Turbitz, a small farming village. Over a third of the passengers on the lost train did not survive. Their bodies left along the tracks because there was no time to bury them. Many years later, a memorial was built to honor those souls who died on the doorsteps of freedom. I have vivid memories of Turbitz. It was spring, and for the first time I saw flowers, trees in bloom, birds in the air. There must have been flowers and birds in Bergen-Belsen, but I never remember seeing them. I only recall the gray, the cold, the misery, and the hopelessness of the place. In Turbitz, my parents commandeered a small farmhouse whose owners had fled in fear of the Soviets and their horrible reputation for brutality. Our mother gave us our first bath in many years and then pointed to a bed with a comforter so white and clean it dazzled. My brother and I refused to sleep there. It all looked too strange and beyond what we had ever seen before. Inseparable also brings into focus that history is rarely complete. Often it takes many years, if not centuries, to fully reveal itself. In our case, the puzzle of our improbable survivor had major missing pieces, discovered more recently, many years after the deaths of our parents. In September 2018, we learned that our family, at some point, held Paraguayan passports that gave them a more privileged status as potential exchange prisoners, perhaps worth more alive than dead, and likely the reason we were sent to Bergen-Belsen than to Auschwitz or Sobibor, where we as young twins would have been killed immediately. In March 2021, the Los Angeles Times published a front-page article written by Steve Lopez, a four-time Pulitzer Prize finalist, under the title of How a Picture in a Newspaper Unlocked Childhood Mysteries for Two Holocaust Survivors. A picture of my brother and me at the age of 6 in traditional Dutch costumes, and you'll see it in a few minutes, had appeared in an earlier op-ed piece that I wrote for the LA Times, where I compared the courage of first-line responders at the height of the COVID epidemic to those who were able to maintain their humanity and grace during the Holocaust. In his investigative piece, Lopez discovered our handmade Dutch costumes came from Urk. So you'll see the picture. We had a wonderful nanny, and it turned out this nanny came from a small fishing village, which I never knew. And she always wore a traditional dress when she came to work for us. At that time, that was not so unusual. But she always wanted her twins to also dress in the traditional clothing of what was then called Holland. And so my mother said, fine, we will do that. And so she bought the outfits that came from her family, and we had a renowned photographer take the picture. And this was the picture that appeared in the newspaper. And actually, when this was the op-ed piece that I wrote, and the op-ed editor wrote me and called me and said, "We're going to print your op-ed piece, but we need a picture. Do you want a picture of the way you look now, or the way you look then?" So I said, "Well, the way I look now is more realistic, but of course the other picture was when it happened. And so I sent her that picture, which became kind of a lightning rod because someone in Los Angeles recognized the unique little outfit that was particular to the fishing villages. And, there we discovered that's where our nanny was, and the reporter, Steve Lopez, was able to connect with her daughter. And her daughter kind of mentioned how much her mother, who was by then had passed away, loved being with us. And then Ellen, the daughter, said, my mother had a special closeness to some of the people she took care of, and so I have a sister called Marion, which was my name. So that was kind of a wonderful revelation. So, from that article, priceless pieces of new information were revealed, further completing the puzzle and against all odds nature of our survival. We must make sure this black and horrific chapter in world history remains revealed and illuminated, its lessons and legacy remembered and recalled for all time to come. We must remain determined and vigilant that this darkest chapter of Jewish history does not repeat itself. We can never be indifferent. We can never be indifferent to injustice, violence, and inhumanity wherever it appears. We must be mindful of history, and we must never forget. So let me end this. I know there are many questions, and this is just a sketch of our story. But I want to end it before slowing this. Well, maybe we'll first see the slides, because then you'll get a little bit more of a sense of our story. So I should just click this. This was my mother with her new twins in 1938, and this was my parents at their honeymoon in Switzerland. Carl and Ilse Hess, extraordinary, extraordinary people. And this picture is of my grandparents, who were head of the lay leaders of the Jewish community in Recklinghausen, and were committed to staying there. And my parents begged them to try to come to Holland, but they didn't. And they got a pass, a 6-hour pass, when we were 3 months old, to visit us. And that was the first and the last time we ever saw them. My grandfather was the head of the board of the synagogue in Recklinghausen. And when it was Kristallnacht, he went out there to try to do whatever he could do to save the synagogue, because that wasn't possible. And he died. He was imprisoned, not for long, but the trauma of that, he suffered a heart attack and died at a young age. And my grandmother died in a terrible Stutthof, a terrible concentration camp. All right, here's some pictures of us before the war. My father with the two of us, and another sweet picture. And so this was a picture that, this iconic picture that kind of started this whole ball rolling, where it was read by someone in Los Angeles who knew this particular costume, because the embroidery of these costumes were different from region to region. And so Steve Lopez wrote this page one story, a very long story. Twins photo unlocks Holocaust mystery. I have to tell you about the photographer, who was a well-known photographer. And he took this picture in the morning in Amsterdam. And by the night, he had been executed by the Nazis in Holland because they discovered that he also helped forge passports for people who wanted to get out of Amsterdam, and kind of got them the pictures and developed these forged passports. He and a group of 12 others, and I mean it was very ironic that that night that group of men were all executed. Okay, yeah. This was the transit camp in Holland. Almost all the Jews who were caught were sent to Westerbork. It's kind of a staging area, and from there were sent to the concentration camps. And in the beginning, these places were kind of barely survivable, but of course, as it became more overcrowded, they became kind of horrific places where people died very quickly, and they were horrible, but of course they weren't as horrible as the actual camps. Actually, Camp Westerbork, in the beginning, I remember that they even had theater and operas, because it turns out that the head Nazi in charge of the camp was a great lover of the arts, so it had that ironic twist. But then, for example, they would clear the hospital of all the children, and they were all just marched on the train to go to Auschwitz. So, I mean, you never knew your fate from day to day, which... Why am I pressing? Okay. So these are the cattle cars. I'm sure you've read about them. But, they were just what they were, the cattle cars. No seats, no food, no water. They were locked. And that's how people went to their destiny. Auschwitz, Sobibor, Bergen-Belsen. So this was Bergen-Belsen, just, the feeling of how gray it was, the terrible weather, the conditions. And, when the Germans, near the end of the war, what happened was when they liberated, quote unquote, or tried to empty out Auschwitz and all those other camps, the inmates went on these death marches where they walked for weeks, days. Most of them passed away, but many of them then arrived at Bergen-Belsen, and then that was when the camp became so overcrowded, and a terrible typhus epidemic when it became really unlivable. I always think this is a poignant slide, because you see people kind of eating whatever they were eating, but in the background there are hundreds of corpses. And, that was life was like. I mean, my brother and I learned to count by counting corpses, to see how many were in a grave, and whether, they were all tangled, whether we could kind of see where their arms and legs were. It sounds very macabre, and of course it's beyond the pale, and nobody should have experienced it. But those, in camp, that was like an everyday occurrence. Okay, and this was, we actually came to America on the Queen Elizabeth, which was, to me, still such an extraordinary memory, because at that time it was a very, very luxurious and fancy ship. Someone reminded me that we had really come on the ship in third class, which was not even tourist class. But I remember it as so extraordinary, luxurious. The trouble is, and this was we arrived in America January 1st, 1947, and it was a terrible crossing, and everybody got violently sick, and nobody appeared in the dining room. But my father, of course, absolutely insisted that we go there for every meal, even though we were just unbelievably nauseous and everything. And I remember that's where I developed a great love of sardines, because it was the one thing that kind of didn't make me feel nauseous. But that's how we arrived in America. And, 2 weeks ago, I gave a talk at the Holocaust Museum in New York City, and the room overlooked the Statue of Liberty. And I remember when we landed, where my parents pointed out the Statue of Liberty and the significance of it. And, that's kind of whenever I see the Statue of Liberty, I always think of it. It was so memorable. And my parents, they so much wanted to come to America, which was not that easy. You needed a sponsor. And my father learned English because he didn't want to come to America not knowing the language. And he felt it was such a privilege to come to this country because it was a land of opportunity. It was a land of democracy. And how he treasured those things. And really, he was always the first one to raise the American flag for any holiday. And so, I think of my parents, how much they honored being Americans, coming to America, and, how much this kind of feeling that America is such a wonderful land of opportunity now it's very scarred, and there's so much discord. But it's, for many, many people, it was their dream come true and still remains that. So this was our first house. So we went to school. We'd never been to school. We were 9 years old, and we were put in kindergarten. And then we were never in the school because every day we were kind of taken somewhere. I guess we were the twins of the Holocaust, and people wanted to honor us and entertain us. And so I remember that at one point I came home and I said to my mother, I said, we never have been to school and we're trying to learn, but every day we had lunch with Eleanor Roosevelt, the United Nations, but we weren't in school. And so I asked my mother, I said, why are we always going places? And she says, well, you're twins and young Holocaust survivors, and people want to do something lovely for you and make you feel special. And that's when I told my mother, I said, I don't always want to be known just as a Holocaust survivor. I want to be known as an American girl. And, in a way, that's always been kind of a little bit of a conflict because I felt it was such a wonderful thing to come to America. My parents instilled in us the importance of contributing to the country and not only living in the past. This was our first car, a Pontiac. So this was on the day when we graduated. I graduated from Barnard. My brother graduated from Columbia, and he was an ensign, I don't know, whatever. He was in the ROTC. And so several of the papers covered this, this was a far cry from Belsen, that we were graduating from college in 1960. And this is my brother. My brother loves coming. He used to fly to come to Easton. He was a pilot. He had a little plane. And since my wonderful mother always came here for the weekends, he would fly in. And so he made frequent appearances here. But now he's of an age where he always says, Marion, I want to sleep in my own bed. And so his spirit is here as well, but he's not here. And so this was amazingly a blanket that we still had from Bergen-Belsen. I don't know how it survived, but it is in our house. And this was a more recent picture. So I want to end by reading. When my mother passed away, we discovered that she had written poems. She had a way with words. And she had written wonderful poems, all reflecting on her past. And so for her memorial service, we put together this book of poems. But there was one that she wrote. She developed terrible eyesight, mostly because of typhus and just the malnutrition. So she was always struggling with her eyes. And there's one poem that she wrote, and it was called Ode to My Eyes. I lived 3 times I died. You wonder why I can't sleep at night. Very often I think my eyes are fine, just saw too much to really shine. Instead of beauty, they had to see what men could do to history. Instead of watching the golden sun rise, they had to look at madmen's eyes. Instead of weeping real tears, their tears dried up before their years. They worked the hardest, desiring the best. That's what they got by taking a rest and seeing only what they wanted to see. I carry them, but they own me. They punished and haunted me for all the horrors they had to see. Since they could have given up on me years ago, I am grateful to them, not quite happy though. Yet, as reward for a valiant fight, they now again let me read and write. In their eyes, they let me win the fight. So we made peace, whatever will be. They promised to always stay with me, as long as I'll go with them instead of they with me. So I think it's a wonderful summary.
Somebody said, the book talks a great deal about the resilience of the human spirit and the courage and strength of your parents under hellish and terrifying conditions. What are some of your memories with regard to do you remember the heroism? And you do, and you may want to share a little bit more about that.
Well, I think my parents at some point made a pact that we would stay together. Of course, they looked into all the options, putting us into hiding or, whatever resources were available. Of course, at that time, we were rather young, and people didn't like to hide young children because it's very hard to keep them quiet. And my parents interviewed quite a few people who wanted to hide us or adopt us. And then I think they came to the decision that whatever happened, we would stay together. And I think really that in the end, if we hadn't had our parents, my brother and I certainly would not have survived. And I think if we hadn't survived, I think my parents would not have had the will and strength to go on, to have that resilience, to survive, which took a lot of strength. It took a certain sense of hope. I mean, if you felt defeated right away, then it was really bad for you, because if you were defeated, you couldn't kind of even hope for redemption or survival. And it's amazing. They used to call those people actually Mussulman, and I never understood why that was their name, but they were called Muslimen. And these were people who just had given up very quickly after arriving in the camps. And I remember that my father, he would always almost say, well, let's not walk too close to him. It was always, a little bit of that person has given up when you needed every ounce of energy. They were, what can I say? Because, in the end, it was, in a way, a miracle. But they had this, first of all, I think they were realistic. And in some way, and I can't even describe to you exactly why, they were strategic. But I think most of all, they were hopeful and had that strength and spirit and resilience to just say, let's, live every day. Let's try to stay alive every day. And when you're in a camp, I even felt that when I was young. You just never think that you're going to wake up the next day. And I remember even coming to America, where I had 2 habits. One was for years and years, I would never go to bed without putting a loaf of bread in my bed, some jam, and some other food
Yeah.
stuff so that I would never be hungry.
Yep.
But also I, had really terrible insomnia, but mostly because I felt, if I kind of lose my guard, that I wouldn't be there. So they were just heroic, and I think that they just had a certain character and inner strength, which I certainly feel that my brother and I owe them, our lives.
One more, and then we'll take questions
Yeah.
from the group. We are witnessing despicable Holocaust denial and growing anti-Semitism and anti-Israel feelings. Is there a message that you want to give in terms of teaching compassion and peace and respect and human appreciation?
Well, yes, and I even said in my little talk, the Holocaust, was an event unlike any other, where really just because you were Jewish, you were condemned to death, and that really makes it unique. But whether what's happening in Gaza and in the Belgian Congo and, in places, North Korea, why shouldn't every human being have at least the hope and the chance to lead a life where they're not oppressed, life when they're not starving? I think every person should be given that gift when they are on this earth. And so, you would think that history gives you those lessons. But sadly, I think, people are not mindful of history. And I think one of the things that really bothers me today is that, the people who are protesting, and, they certainly have a right to protest, and there are things to protest, but it's almost like they don't want to know the history. It's an uninformed form of protesting that causes so much damage. So, certainly as a very old person who has gone through the Holocaust, you would think that would be a strong enough message for people to remember and try to be different. But maybe that's unrealistic. I'm beginning to feel that the world doesn't turn that way.
I think one of the most important passages ever written in English literature is Shylock's speech. Right? Hath not a Jew eyes, hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections. And if we resemble you in this, many of you are familiar with it. And yes, that's the challenge, the problem, and the issue. So questions from the audience, please raise your hand and the mic will be given to you. Over here.
Maybe you said this, and maybe you already said this, and maybe I missed it, but what did your father do? What did your family do for work?
I'm sorry,
What did your family do for work? What did your father do?
For work. Well, my mother actually came from a very well-off family in Germany, and my father grew up in a very religious Jewish household in kind of a small town in Germany, Fulda. And he turned his back to that. He felt it was too restricted. And he went to Berlin, and he actually became a very successful businessman. And that is also why when Nazi came to, when Hitler first, kind of became a force in Germany and the growth of Nazism, many people who were very assimilated and had led good lives, didn't see the writing on the wall, and so they left late. And so when my parents came to America, my father became, of course, he had never gone to college. He had tried to go to college, but because at that time they had these restrictive rules, and so he became a traveling salesman, but a very good one.
Thank you.
I'm sure. Thank you so much for this. Days had to have been not typical, of course, but describe one of your days, sort of a regular sort of day at Bergen-Belsen. The question was just
I
your
did see
little days.
that. I did hear it. Well, you know, it was in the beginning, actually, in the early times in Bergen-Belsen, there were some other children there, and we even had kind of a makeshift little kindergarten group that I think my mother actually organized or someone, but then things, you know, really progressively got worse and worse, and, you know, that was no longer realistic. So I remember always being cold, and, you know, the day started out by appel, which means that everyone, before they went to work, so it had to be very early, had to appear for, you know, just so that someone could look at a list and call out and everybody was present. I think it was another form of torture that the Nazis decided to impose on prisoners who, you know, in the winter didn't have coats or anything. And, you know, very often we were there for 2 or 3 hours. I mean, people were shot and people collapsed. But I remember that was a big part of our day. And then, you know, the adults all went to their slave labor assignments, whether it was a shoe factory or building roads, et cetera, et cetera. So my brother and I basically were left to our own devices. There were some older people who were very disabled, who were able, you know, were not, didn't go to work, and they kind of took care of us, I would say. But, you know, but we had, you know, we had games. One of the main games was actually taking lice out of our hair and lining in, because when you killed them, it made a pop like a crack. And we would line them up and then learn to count that way. So we, you know, that's, you know, I mean, it was just being on another planet. You know, it's kind of, it's a world that it's really, because it's not really a world. It's not really a livable world or a humane world. And so, you know, we just, and then the camp actually was strafed because the Allies thought that it was, you know, kind of German installation. They didn't realize that it had all these prisoners, and it was strafed, and several people died in that. And my brother gives me credit for saving his life, because I just pulled him into the bathroom. I mean, the bathrooms were horrible places, but some of it was, you know, kind of cement rather than just wood. And so somehow I had this idea of dragging him to that and, you know, hiding him under a sink. So it was, you know, it was a dismal day-to-day life. And, you know, the best birthday present, so I remember that one, was that for our 6th birthday, my father ostensibly sold his wedding ring for this and gave us a sandwich with chocolate sprinkles. Chocolate sprinkles were a Dutch specialty, kind of a certain kind of bread and butter and these chocolate sprinkles. And somehow he had managed to get that. I mean, and they gave us each a half of that, which I think I ate over 3 months. I mean, I'd like 2 or 3 crumbs a day. And, you know, that was really the best birthday present I ever got. You know, but there was still this form, I mean, amazing, there was still this form of barter in the camp where you could give someone a wedding ring and somehow they managed to, you know, give you a piece of bread. I mean, some of those people were working for the canteens of the Nazis, and were able to obtain things that way.
Thanks very much for sharing these memories. Could you walk us through what it was like for your family's reemergence out of the darkness in the months after Soviets liberated you? When did you go back to the Western Allies? What kind of medical and malnutrition treatment did you get? And just what happened? What do you remember about your spirits during that
Is that
reemergence?
particularly the Soviets or just generally?
The Soviet, generally. You want to talk specifically about the Soviets or just generally? Generally.
Well, you know, my parents, and certainly another reason why I thought that they were so remarkable, because we were young children. Let's face it, we had a life that we could start over. But for my parents, you know, that was really not possible because, well, especially my father was middle-aged by the time he came to America. But they, you know, they had such faith and joy of being in America. And they really very strongly felt that we should not live in the past, that we owed America, you know, kind of our best efforts, that we should get a good education and contribute to, in whatever way we could. And then, you know, that was the amazing thing. And, you know, I think my father, of all of us, was most severely affected. And my mother affected in different ways. I mean, one thing is I think about my mother because she was an only child, a beloved only child. And, you know, after the war, I mean, that's another thing I think about, you know, where we carry our phones, we know where everyone is any moment, or we can check on them. And then to kind of feel that you're in these camps and you have no idea what happened to your father, to your sisters, to your brother, for years and years. And so I remember that after the war, she wanted to find out what happened to her mother. She didn't even know where she was. And she would put, you know, little ads in the newspaper saying, yes, did anyone know Fanny Hess, et cetera, et cetera. And then she discovered that she had been sent to this horrible concentration camp and died, I think, a week before liberation, where they took the remaining survivors and took them in a boat to a lake and tipped over the boat and shot them. And so, you know, I think those memories, and my mother always, I remember, well, talking about my mother, when she finally moved to Washington, and she loved coming to Easton. But my mother had the habit, and she was this lovely woman, a beautiful woman. When we were together in Chevy Chase, I kind of forced her to come and live close to me. And she would every 2 hours say, Marion, she had lovely, let's go for coffee. Let's have something to eat. And so we would go where that was even before Starbucks, so we went to Starbucks too. And we would go and have coffee, and that's really where I learned so much, because she finally, you know, kind of revealed what had happened. And I always say, and I said to my mother, I said, why do you love so often in a day just to go for coffee and sit down? And she said, you know how wonderful that is, first of all, to eat something that you like and to be sitting down. And I realized that in the camp, you never sat down for a meal. I mean, it was always standing up, and 15 minutes later, the whistle. And, you know, to feel you could be a civilized person and have a lovely cup of coffee and have a conversation. So, you know, my parents, of course, were affected, but I think that they just encouraged us very much to focus on the privilege of being here. And so, you know, they rarely spoke about their experiences. And, you know, they never knew. For example, the reason we ended up in Bergen-Belsen, where at least there was a chance to survive, was because we had at some point passports, Paraguayan passports, Latin American, South American passports, and Paraguay was neutral in the war, and so some officials kind of got to some of the higher up Nazis and said, you should kind of accept these Paraguayan passports, even though the people may not be Paraguayan, because some people are worth perhaps more alive than dead, so that they could be used as exchange prisoners. So, my parents never discovered that we had these. My father always said he applied for it, but he never got it. And so, of course, what happened was that these passports, which were actually forged in Switzerland, that's a whole other amazing story, were sent to people's homes and arrived at people's homes when they were already taken away. But the Nazis also were given the list, so they knew who had them. And of course, that was also, kind of a great, I think that if we hadn't had those passports, we would not be here today. But of course, my parents never knew why we ended up in Bergen-Belsen rather than Auschwitz. So I'm straying from your question, I'm sorry. But
okay.
so, it was always with us. But I think my parents very much wanted to protect us and didn't want us to have that burden. And similarly, I think I've made a mistake now. I have wonderful children, and I never spoke to them about my past. Now they have the book, and of course, we've been on TV and things like that. It's always kind of a question about how long do you carry this burden of the memories with you, and how do you share it with your children without feeling that they then have the burden. They should certainly have the memory, and they should know their history, but you don't want them to have the burden.
The book is filled with history. I had one quick example. Somebody who was reading the book, knowing that you were coming, and that person couldn't make today. She was fortunate. She said, I read in the book that the Vatican helped Joseph Mengele escape from Europe to South America. And she was just dumbfounded that the reality of history even touched the Vatican.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the really, I have to thank Ferris Castle, the author, who lives in Eugene, Oregon, so far away, but she did an amazing job of weaving the history.
If you haven't read the book, let me recommend it to you. It's really good. So, thank you. Yes, Francis?
Thank you very much. And also, I think you expand a little bit more. You've said something about how your parents helped you not to have resentment. And what has allowed you to be this kind of ambassador, speaking with this kind of objectivity about these values?
Well,
Do you hear me?
Yes.
What did your parents do to enable you to be the ambassador that you are, to speak so eloquently of your past?
a recent ambassador. They set an example. And I think also because, they had children, they wanted us to see the opportunity of getting a good education, contributing. I feel very much like I've been blessed because lovely things have happened to me. I never go a day actually without thinking about my past. As people who know me, for example, I kind of never go a day without having flowers in my house, because when I first saw flowers when we were liberated, I thought they were totally miracles, the color and the shapes, and that day never goes by without me reflecting on how lucky I have been and all that I can say is be enormously thankful. Do I deserve that luck? You know, when all those other people who were just had as much promise and probably even more talent who didn't make it. But I feel that, you know, I now represent them, and of course we're fast disappearing. But I do feel that it was, you know, the values of my parents and their courage and their strength. And as I said, they felt really privileged and blessed to come to America, and they felt that we should put these deep scars and shadows of our lives, not to forget them, but to not for them always to be overwhelming when we were so lucky to, you know, be able to start our lives over.
Last question.
I'm interested in the concept of forgiveness. Of course, the examples that you give are horrific beyond any of our imagination. So we come away with a sense of blessing and good luck that you've gotten out of it. But what about that other side of forgiveness? About this stuff didn't have to happen, it happened. How do you deal with that? You have a love affair, you have a husband, you have your kids. What's the next, how do you help them with the next step?
So this is, I'm so sorry, this is for forgiveness or
Yes.
your enemies, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting story too, because after the war, I never wanted to go back to Germany. And my parents did take one trip, which was, you know, was very difficult. It just so happens when I was in college, they were doing a memorial for Anne Frank, and her father, who was still alive, asked me to be a representative. He couldn't make it, and so he said, you know, could you just be her representative? I mean, that was quite kind of, I could never be her representative, but in any case, I went and took part in this ceremony. And then afterwards, there was a lunch, and a gentleman who, you know, quite young, came up to me and said, you know, you don't believe, he was a diplomat, but you don't believe all the stories that they tell you about this place. Of course, he had he didn't make a connection or whatever. And so, you know, he was actually a Holocaust denier. And he said, you know, part of this was all fantasy. And I said to myself, well, I told him, and I said, well, it wasn't fantasy, I was here. And I experienced it all. So, but that was, you know, my first encounter by someone here. We were there for an historical occasion, and this is the person who says, well, it really didn't happen here. And then several years later, I went to Germany, and I was having lunch across where we were staying, having breakfast. And, you know, it used to be, for many years, when I heard Germans speaking, I would break out in a cold sweat. And I would become kind of, unlike myself, very aggressive. I'd go up to people and, you know, say something awful to them. But here I was of a certain age, and, you know, everybody, I looked at this cafe, and everyone, I said, you know, all these people are younger than I was, and it's a whole different generation. And, you know, I have to have a different outlook. And so, you know, hatred and retribution, I think, are, you know, I don't know how productive they are. You know, if you spend your life in just kind of hating people, remembering the horrors that were bestowed, I mean, you should remember them so that you don't go in that path, and you tell your children not to go in that path. But I feel, you know, in the relatively short time that we have in this world, we have to think more positively. I mean, realistically as well. But, you know, if you focus it on people who harmed you, or not that they should be forgiven, but, you know, you have only one life to lead, and you say, how can I do it a little bit better? How can I remember that, carry it with me, but still, you know, still be positive and still have, you know, the spirit of just appreciating this precious life that you have.
You know, your words remind me of what George Santayana said. Those who forget the past are doomed to relive it. And we want to, can we thank Marion for her?
Thank you.